The easiest way to spot fake authority is to watch what happens when real authority quietly walks into the room. The first thing I noticed was not the flashing amber lights behind my wife's sport utility vehicle. It was the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach the moment she pulled onto the narrow gravel shoulder beside Pine Ridge Lake. I was driving about 200 yards behind her after we had left the local farmers market separately because I had stayed behind to help an elderly vendor load folding tables into his pickup. The late afternoon sun reflected across the water like polished glass, and a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine trees through my open window. At first, nothing looked unusual. A white utility vehicle with magnetic security markings sat behind Emily's vehicle, and 3 people wearing matching dark uniforms stepped out with confident expressions. One of them pointed toward the driver's window while another appeared to write something on a clipboard. From a distance, anyone would have assumed it was some kind of official neighborhood inspection. Then I noticed what did not belong. Their vehicle had no municipal markings. Their emergency lights were inexpensive aftermarket equipment mounted inside the windshield. Their uniforms looked close enough to resemble law enforcement, but every detail felt slightly off, like someone had copied the appearance without understanding the responsibility that came with it. Emily lowered her window halfway and listened without interrupting. She never looked nervous. She never argued. She simply rested one hand on the steering wheel while the other remained out of sight near the center console. Even from where I sat, I recognized the expression on her face. It was the same calm look she wore whenever someone underestimated her. One of the men leaned closer to her window and pointed toward a laminated badge hanging from his chest. Another circled slowly around the back of her vehicle as though conducting an inspection. The woman standing beside them folded her arms and watched passing traffic with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting every driver to believe whatever story they had prepared. My first instinct was to pull over immediately and walk toward them, but something told me to wait. Emily had always asked me never to interfere unless she specifically needed help. During our 15 years of marriage, she had rarely spoken about her work. She believed that bringing difficult cases home only made family life heavier than it needed to be. I respected that boundary, even though it often left me wondering how someone so gentle around neighbors could remain so composed under pressure. I watched another minute pass as one of the uniformed men demanded identification through the open window. Emily nodded politely, reached toward her purse with slow deliberate movements, and looked directly into his eyes. None of them realized they had chosen the wrong driver, on the wrong road, on the wrong afternoon. They believed they were stopping an ordinary homeowner returning from a weekend errand. They had no idea that every confident word leaving their mouths was quietly becoming evidence, and they certainly did not know the woman sitting behind that steering wheel carried something far more powerful than the fake badges hanging around their own necks. When people met Emily for the first time, they usually remembered 2 things. The first was how easily she smiled at complete strangers. The second was how impossible it was to get her to talk about her job. We had been married for 15 years, and even I knew there were questions she would answer with nothing more than a quiet smile before changing the subject to something far more ordinary. That was simply how she separated work from home. Our weekends belonged to us, not to whatever responsibilities waited for her after Monday morning. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and if you had asked me to describe my wife before everything happened on that lakeside road, I would have started with the little things. She never forgot birthdays. She baked cinnamon bread every autumn because it reminded her of her grandmother. She always carried an extra blanket in the back of her sport utility vehicle in case someone became stranded during the winter. She volunteered at the local animal shelter whenever her schedule allowed, and somehow every injured dog trusted her within minutes. None of those habits looked extraordinary. Together they created the woman everyone in town believed they knew. We had moved to Pine Ridge Lake nearly 8 years earlier after my construction company completed several infrastructure projects across the county. The cabin overlooking the water became our escape from conference rooms, deadlines, and constant phone calls. Every Saturday morning we walked the same trail around the shoreline before stopping at the farmers market on Main Street. The vendors knew Emily by name because she always asked about their families before buying fresh vegetables or homemade jam. She never acted like someone carrying serious responsibilities. She preferred blending into ordinary life. Looking back, I think that was exactly why she became so good at her work. She listened far more than she spoke, noticed details other people ignored, and never felt the need to remind anyone of her qualifications. A few months before that afternoon by the lake, I had casually asked why she always kept a locked leather case inside the center console of her vehicle. She smiled, tapped my hand, and said, "Some things stay there because I hope I never need them." I accepted the answer because trust had always been the strongest part of our marriage. She respected my work without asking about confidential contracts, and I respected hers the same way. There were moments, though, when small clues quietly slipped through. A late evening phone call answered with only a few calm words. An unexpected trip to another county that ended before sunrise. A carefully pressed blazer hanging separately from the rest of her clothes. None of those details seemed important until later. Standing behind my windshield that afternoon, watching three strangers confidently surround her vehicle, those forgotten moments suddenly returned to me one after another. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle I had never realized I was assembling. The woman sitting calmly behind that steering wheel was exactly the same wife who laughed beside campfires, planted flowers outside our cabin, and brought homemade cookies to new neighbors. The difference was that the people standing outside her window had mistaken kindness for weakness, and they were about to discover that the quietest person in the room is often the one who understands the situation better than everyone else. Kevin Dawson liked to describe himself as someone who believed in order. That was the word he repeated during every homeowners association meeting, every community newsletter, and every conversation that ended with someone receiving another warning letter. Order. According to Kevin, neighborhoods only stayed safe when residents accepted firm leadership without asking too many questions. Most newcomers believed him because Pine Ridge Lake looked like the perfect place to raise a family. The sidewalks were clean, flower beds were carefully maintained, and the waterfront homes reflected peacefully across the lake every evening. What many people did not notice was how quickly ordinary community rules had evolved into something much larger. It started with volunteer patrols driving through the neighborhood after dark. Then came reflective uniforms that looked surprisingly official. A few months later, magnetic vehicle decals appeared, followed by flashing amber lights mounted inside windshields and laminated identification cards hanging from matching lanyards. Kevin insisted none of it was intended to imitate law enforcement. He claimed the neighborhood simply wanted to promote safety and discourage trespassing. Some residents appreciated the extra visibility. Others quietly questioned why volunteers suddenly expected drivers to stop and answer questions on public roads leading toward the lake. I first became uncomfortable when one of my construction supervisors mentioned being delayed on his way to our cabin because someone wearing one of those uniforms wanted to verify where he was going. A retired teacher told me she had been asked to explain why unfamiliar relatives were visiting for the weekend. Another neighbor laughed nervously while describing how volunteers had written down the license plate numbers of several delivery vehicles. None of those incidents seemed dramatic on their own, but together they revealed a growing confidence that had little to do with maintaining flower beds or organizing neighborhood picnics. Kevin always defended the patrols by saying responsible people had nothing to fear from responsible neighbors. That sentence sounded reassuring until you realized nobody had clearly defined where neighborly concern ended and claimed authority began. The volunteers themselves appeared to enjoy the attention. They walked through the community carrying clipboards, speaking in firm voices, and introducing themselves with titles that sounded far more official than their actual responsibilities. Most residents avoided arguments because they wanted quiet lives, not public disputes with the homeowners association. Emily noticed something different almost immediately. During one evening walk around the lake, she quietly pointed toward one of the patrol vehicles and asked whether I had ever looked closely at the emergency lighting mounted behind the windshield. I admitted I had not. She studied it for another moment before simply saying, "Details matter." She never explained what she meant, and I did not press for answers. Looking back now, I realized she had already recognized several inconsistencies long before anyone else did. She understood that real authority is built on lawful responsibility, not on uniforms or confident voices. Kevin and his volunteers believed appearances alone would convince everyone to comply. They had spent months practicing how to look official. Unfortunately for them, they never expected someone who understood exactly what genuine authority looked like to cross their path on an ordinary afternoon beside Pine Ridge Lake. The strange encounter slowly became part of everyday life around Pine Ridge Lake. At first, people treated them like annoying inconveniences that would eventually disappear on their own. A family driving home after dinner would mention being asked where they lived. A delivery driver would complain that someone wearing a dark uniform wanted to record the license plate before allowing access to a private driveway. A retired couple laughed nervously while describing how volunteers insisted on seeing identification before they could launch their fishing boat from a community dock they had used for nearly 20 years. Every story sounded just unusual enough to make people uncomfortable, yet never dramatic enough for anyone to believe something larger was happening. Kevin Dawson seemed to understand exactly how far he could push without attracting serious attention. His patrol volunteers always remained polite on the surface. They smiled. They thanked people for their cooperation. They repeated phrases like community safety and neighborhood standards until those words almost sounded reasonable. But beneath the carefully practiced manners was an expectation that everyone should obey without asking simple questions. Who gave you this authority? What law allows this? Why should residents stop simply because someone is wearing a uniform purchased online? Those questions rarely received direct answers. Instead, conversations usually ended with warnings that failing to cooperate could result in reports being forwarded to the Homeowners Association Board. I began noticing another pattern as well. The patrols almost always appeared near properties owned by residents who had previously disagreed with Kevin during association meetings. It was subtle enough that most people never connected the dots, but once I started paying attention, the timing became impossible to ignore. One contractor working on a roof replacement called me after being delayed nearly 30 minutes by volunteers asking unnecessary questions about permits that had already been approved by the county. Another neighbor quietly admitted she had stopped inviting relatives to spend weekends at the lake because she did not want them feeling uncomfortable during visits. Emily listened patiently every time someone shared another story. She never interrupted. She never rushed to offer opinions. Instead, she asked calm, thoughtful questions that seemed almost insignificant at the time. What color were the vehicle lights? Did anyone identify themselves by name? Were the conversations recorded? Did they request documents or simply ask questions? I assumed she was just naturally curious, but looking back, I realized she was mentally organizing details the same way an experienced investigator assembles pieces of a much larger picture. One evening we sat together on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the pine trees while the lake reflected deep shades of orange and gold. The air smelled of cedar, fresh grass, and distant campfires drifting across the shoreline. I finally asked whether she believed the neighborhood patrols had gone too far. She remained quiet for a long moment before answering with a sentence I never forgot. Real authority never depends on convincing people to pretend. She looked back toward the quiet road leading into the community and added nothing else. At the time I thought she was simply expressing an opinion. I did not realize she had already noticed details that everyone else had overlooked, and that somewhere beneath those matching uniforms, polished speeches, and confident smiles, the entire performance was beginning to unravel one careful observation at a time. Over the next several days, I stopped dismissing my instincts as simple coincidence and started paying attention the way Emily always did. Once I looked beyond the uniforms and confident voices, small details began standing out everywhere. One afternoon I watched one of Kevin's patrol vehicles pull into the grocery store parking lot. The magnetic door decals had been removed before the driver parked, then carefully placed back onto the doors before the vehicle returned to the neighborhood. Another evening I noticed one of the volunteers adjusting a dashboard light that looked more like something purchased from an online catalog than equipment issued through any official agency. Their radios never sounded like coordinated dispatch traffic. Instead, short conversations came through ordinary handheld devices that crackled with poor reception. Individually those details meant very little, but together they painted a picture that became harder to ignore. Emily never rushed me toward conclusions. She simply asked thoughtful questions each time I shared another observation. "Did you notice whether they introduced themselves by full name?" she asked one evening while we prepared dinner together. I admitted that most people simply called one another by first names or nicknames. She nodded quietly before asking another question. "Did anyone provide written information explaining their authority?" Again, the answer was no. Every interaction seemed designed to create the appearance of official responsibility without ever clearly defining where that responsibility actually came from. I finally asked why those questions mattered so much. She smiled gently, stirred the soup simmering on the stove, and answered with the same calm voice she always used when explaining something important. "Real professionals never rely on confusion. Clear authority protects everyone involved." That sentence stayed with me long after dinner ended. The following weekend we attended another neighborhood gathering near the marina. Children skipped stones across the water while families shared homemade desserts beneath large oak trees. Kevin walked through the crowd shaking hands as though he were hosting a campaign event instead of a community picnic. Several patrol volunteers remained nearby wearing matching uniforms despite there being no emergency or organized event requiring them. I watched visitors glance toward the uniforms with automatic respect before continuing their conversations. It struck me how easily appearances influenced assumptions. A neatly pressed uniform, a confident posture, and a vehicle with flashing lights could persuade many people without a single word ever being spoken. As the evening came to a close, Emily quietly excused herself to return a borrowed serving dish to one of our neighbors. While she was away, Kevin approached me with his usual practiced smile. He complimented my construction company, asked polite questions about recent projects, then casually suggested that neighborhood cooperation became much easier when everyone supported the patrol program. I answered politely but offered no commitment. His smile remained, although I noticed a brief flicker of disappointment before he wished me a pleasant evening and walked away. When Emily returned, she asked whether everything had gone well. I simply nodded, but something inside me had already changed. For the first time, I stopped viewing the patrols as an overenthusiastic neighborhood program and started wondering whether someone had become so comfortable pretending to possess authority that they no longer recognized the difference between appearance and legitimacy. Watching the last rays of sunlight disappear across Pine Ridge Lake that evening, I had the unmistakable feeling that our quiet community was drifting toward a moment none of us could avoid much longer. 2 evenings before everything unfolded on that quiet lakeside road, Emily came home later than usual carrying the same worn leather messenger bag she had owned for years. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything extraordinary. She smiled when she walked through the front door, set fresh apples on the kitchen counter from a roadside stand, and asked whether I wanted grilled salmon for dinner. The familiar scent of rosemary and garlic soon filled the cabin while soft music played from an old speaker near the fireplace. It felt like every other peaceful evening we had shared since moving to Pine Ridge Lake. Yet something about her expression told me she was carrying thoughts she could not completely leave behind. After dinner we stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of hot tea. The lake reflected a sky full of stars, and the cool breeze carried the smell of cedar and damp earth through the surrounding pine trees. We sat together in comfortable silence until Emily finally spoke. She told me there was a chance the next few weeks might become unusually busy at work. She apologized in advance if she needed to answer unexpected phone calls or leave home at inconvenient hours. I smiled and reminded her that she had never needed permission to do the job she cared about. She reached across the small wooden table and squeezed my hand before quietly adding one sentence that stayed with me long afterward. "If something ever looks unusual, trust what you see, not what someone wants you to believe." I laughed softly and asked whether that was supposed to be mysterious advice. She smiled but never answered directly. Instead, she looked toward the still water and changed the conversation to plans for the weekend farmers market. The following morning we loaded reusable grocery bags into separate vehicles because I needed to stop by one of my construction sites before meeting her later in town. As she placed a small insulated cooler into the back of her sport utility vehicle, I noticed the familiar locked leather case inside the center console when the driver's door opened. It disappeared again before I could take a second look. Emily noticed my curiosity and simply smiled. "Hopefully it stays exactly where it is," she said before closing the door. We spent the morning enjoying ordinary routines. She bought homemade bread from a local baker while I picked up fresh vegetables and chatted with several neighbors about upcoming dock repairs after the winter season. Nothing about the day hinted that it would become memorable. The streets were filled with families, bicycles rolled slowly along the sidewalks, and children laughed near the fountain in the town square. It was exactly the kind of peaceful afternoon that makes people lower their guard because everything feels familiar. When we finished shopping, Emily suggested that I stop by the hardware store for supplies while she drove home with the groceries. We agreed to meet back at the cabin before sunset. As I watched her pull away with an easy wave through the open window, I had absolutely no reason to believe the short drive around Pine Ridge Lake would become the moment when months of quiet observations, unanswered questions, and carefully hidden truths would finally begin fitting together into a story neither of us would ever forget. By the time I left the hardware store, the afternoon sun had begun settling lower over Pine Ridge Lake, casting long golden reflections across the calm water beside the road. My truck was only a few minutes behind Emily's sport utility vehicle, and I remember thinking how ordinary the day still felt. The bags of lumber brackets and stainless steel fasteners rested on the passenger seat while the smell of fresh-cut cedar drifted through the open window from a nearby sawmill. Then I rounded the next curve and immediately saw the flashing amber lights ahead. Emily's vehicle sat motionless on the gravel shoulder exactly where I had watched it pull away only minutes earlier. The white utility vehicle remained parked directly behind her with its magnetic security decals visible along both front doors. 3 uniformed volunteers stood around her vehicle with the confidence of people who believed they controlled the entire situation. I slowed instinctively and parked well behind them without drawing attention to myself. From that distance I could hear only scattered pieces of conversation carried by the breeze moving across the lake. One man appeared to be asking repeated questions while another slowly walked around Emily's vehicle writing notes on a clipboard. The third volunteer remained near the rear bumper, carefully watching passing traffic as though trying to project the appearance of an official roadside operation. Emily stayed seated with both hands calmly visible on the steering wheel. She never rushed her movements or raised her voice. Watching her through the windshield, I recognized something that many people overlooked. She was not simply cooperating. She was observing. Every glance, every question directed toward her, every unnecessary instruction seemed to receive the same quiet attention she always gave to details other people ignored. The volunteer nearest her window pointed toward his laminated identification card several times while speaking with increasing confidence. Emily listened patiently, occasionally nodding before asking short, respectful questions that seemed almost too ordinary to matter. I could not hear every word, but I noticed the volunteers answering far more than they had originally intended. They appeared eager to explain who they were, why they believed they could stop vehicles, and what authority they claimed to possess. The longer the conversation continued, the more relaxed they became. One even smiled as though convinced the encounter had already ended in their favor. That unexpected confidence unsettled me because it felt completely disconnected from reality. Emily had always told me that people reveal the most about themselves when they believe nobody is questioning them. Standing beside the road, those volunteers looked less like cautious neighborhood representatives and more like performers becoming increasingly comfortable with their own script. A pickup truck carrying fishing gear slowed briefly before continuing toward the marina. A young family driving a minivan passed carefully around the stopped vehicles without interfering. To every passing motorist, the scene probably looked official enough to avoid a second glance. I knew better now. Every observation from the previous months suddenly returned to my mind at once. The removable vehicle decals. The inexpensive emergency lights. The carefully rehearsed language. The unanswered questions about authority. Emily had quietly connected those pieces long before I ever did. Now she was allowing the picture to finish revealing itself. Sitting behind the wheel with the afternoon sunlight reflecting across her windshield, she remained completely composed while the three volunteers unknowingly continued building the very story they believed they were controlling. The conversation beside the road continued for several more minutes, and the longer it lasted, the more I realized Emily was allowing silence to do the work that arguments never could. She answered every question with calm courtesy, never volunteering unnecessary information and never challenging the three volunteers directly. Instead, she encouraged them to keep talking. The man holding the clipboard confidently explained that their neighborhood patrol had authority to stop suspicious vehicles entering the community. Another volunteer proudly pointed toward the magnetic insignia attached to the utility vehicle and described their security program as an extension of the homeowners association's responsibility to protect residents. The woman standing near the rear of the sport utility vehicle nodded in agreement while occasionally glancing at passing traffic, apparently pleased that every driver slowing down seemed to accept the scene without hesitation. Emily listened carefully, then politely asked who had authorized them to conduct roadside stops on a public county road. The question sounded simple, almost casual, but it noticeably changed the rhythm of the conversation. The volunteer with the clipboard quickly answered that the Homeowners Association board had approved the patrol program. Emily thanked him and followed with another calm question. Does the county sheriff's office supervise these traffic stops? The three volunteers briefly looked at one another before the tallest man responded that such supervision was unnecessary because they were only protecting the neighborhood. Emily nodded once, as though confirming something she had already suspected. She then asked whether every volunteer had completed certified law enforcement training. Again, another exchange of uncertain glances followed before someone answered that experience within the association was more important than formal credentials. Standing beside my truck, I recognized the same patient expression Emily wore whenever she quietly solved complicated problems. She was not searching for confrontation. She was carefully allowing each answer to reveal another missing piece. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh pine across the roadside while gentle waves shimmered behind them on the lake. Everything around us remained remarkably peaceful despite the growing tension inside the conversation. A cyclist slowed while passing, looked briefly toward the stopped vehicles, then continued along the shoulder without stopping. To every outsider, it still appeared to be a routine roadside interaction. Only Emily understood how important every statement had become. She finally reached into her purse with slow, deliberate movements after informing the volunteers exactly what she was doing before touching anything inside the vehicle. None of them objected. In fact, they appeared increasingly confident that she was about to produce an ordinary driver's license and vehicle registration. One of the volunteers even relaxed enough to joke that cooperation always made these situations easier. Emily responded with a polite smile that revealed nothing. She removed a slim leather wallet and rested it quietly on the steering wheel without opening it immediately. The volunteers leaned slightly closer, expecting the conversation to end exactly as every previous encounter had ended. Watching from behind my windshield, I suddenly remembered the locked leather case inside the center console, the mysterious advice she had given me on the porch, and the countless times she had reminded me that appearances often distract people from the truth. At that moment I realized she had never been uncertain about what was happening beside the road. She had simply been waiting until every important question had already been answered before revealing the one detail that would change the entire afternoon. Emily rested the small leather wallet on the steering wheel for another second before opening it with the same calm precision she had shown since the moment the volunteers stopped her vehicle. Nobody spoke. The breeze moved gently through the pine trees lining the road, carrying the scent of fresh cedar across the shoulder while the lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The tallest volunteer extended one hand, apparently expecting an ordinary driver's license. Instead, Emily quietly unfolded the wallet just enough for the official badge and identification inside to become visible. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a dramatic announcement. She simply held the credentials where everyone standing beside her window could clearly see them. The confidence on the volunteers' faces disappeared almost instantly. Their expressions shifted from certainty to confusion as they looked from the badge to Emily, then toward one another as though silently hoping someone else understood what had just happened. Emily calmly closed the wallet again and placed it beside the steering wheel. "Now," she said in the same steady tone she had used throughout the conversation, "I would like each of you to remain exactly where you are and avoid discussing this situation among yourselves." No one laughed. No one argued. The man holding the clipboard slowly lowered it to his side, while the volunteer near the rear of the vehicle instinctively took a small step backward. Kevin Dawson, who had arrived only moments earlier in another sport utility vehicle after receiving a call from his patrol team, stood several yards away watching the scene unfold. Even from my position farther down the shoulder, I could see the uncertainty spreading across his face. Emily reached calmly toward the center console, not to retrieve anything unexpected, but to activate the hands-free communication system already installed in her vehicle. She identified herself clearly, provided her location, and requested additional personnel to respond. Every word was measured, professional, and remarkably ordinary. There was no panic because none was necessary. The volunteers had already provided their own explanations, described their claimed authority, and answered every important question before they ever knew who they were speaking with. That realization slowly settled across the roadside like the evening shadows beginning to stretch over the lake. Kevin finally stepped forward and attempted to explain that everything had been a misunderstanding intended only to protect the community. Emily listened politely without interrupting. When he finished, she simply asked whether he wished to change any of the statements already made by his volunteers regarding roadside stops, claimed authority, or neighborhood enforcement activities. Kevin hesitated long enough for the silence itself to become an answer. I remained beside my truck, watching the woman I had known for 15 years handle one of the most remarkable moments I had ever witnessed without raising her voice even once. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had not argued. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace. Within minutes, the distant sound of approaching vehicles echoed along the quiet road. Several official county units came into view, moving steadily toward the scene with clearly marked vehicles and uniformed personnel. The difference between practiced appearance and genuine authority became obvious before a single additional word was spoken. Emily stepped out of her sport utility vehicle for the first time since the stop began, greeted the arriving officers with quiet professionalism, and began explaining the situation in an organized, factual sequence. Standing there beside Pine Ridge Lake, I finally understood exactly what she had meant when she once told me that real authority never depends on convincing people to pretend. The atmosphere changed completely within minutes of the official county vehicles arriving beside the lake. Unlike the carefully staged appearance of the neighborhood patrol, everything about the responding officers reflected quiet professionalism. Clearly marked vehicles parked in safe positions along the shoulder, each deputy calmly introduced themselves, and every conversation began with simple, direct questions instead of assumptions. The flashing emergency lights reflected softly across the calm water while the late afternoon breeze continued carrying the familiar scent of pine through the trees. Emily greeted the first supervising deputy with the relaxed confidence of someone meeting a trusted colleague rather than stepping into a dramatic confrontation. She briefly identified herself, summarized the sequence of events in precise chronological order, and handed over the notes she had quietly recorded during the roadside stop. There were no exaggerated accusations and no emotional speeches. Every statement focused on observable facts, the exact words spoken by the volunteers, and the questions they had answered voluntarily. The supervising deputy thanked her, then began speaking individually with each member of the neighborhood patrol. I noticed how different the conversations looked now. The volunteers who had confidently spoken over one another only minutes earlier suddenly answered slowly, often pausing before responding. The clipboard remained tucked beneath one man's arm, but he no longer appeared eager to explain his authority. Kevin Dawson attempted to reassure everyone that the entire situation resulted from an unfortunate misunderstanding between community volunteers and a resident. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she quietly reminded the supervising deputy that several important statements had already been made before anyone present knew her professional role. She also explained that multiple passing motorists had observed portions of the roadside stop and that several nearby security cameras positioned at neighboring properties might provide additional context if investigators requested the recordings. The deputy nodded appreciatively and carefully added each point to his notebook. Standing beside my truck, I realized that Emily had never intended to surprise anyone with her identity. Her goal had been much simpler. She wanted the truth to develop naturally without interference. As the conversations continued, another deputy examined the utility vehicle used by the neighborhood patrol. The removable magnetic decals, aftermarket lighting equipment, and identification materials were documented exactly as they appeared. Nothing was rushed. Everything followed an orderly process that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had defined the original stop. The lake remained peaceful behind us, almost indifferent to the tension unfolding beside the road. A pair of ducks crossed the water while distant boat engines echoed across the shoreline. It felt strangely comforting that nature continued exactly as it always had, reminding me how temporary moments of confusion really are. Before leaving the scene, the supervising deputy thanked everyone for their cooperation and explained that the matter would proceed through the appropriate legal and administrative channels after all relevant evidence had been reviewed. Emily simply nodded, gathered her belongings, and closed the driver's door of her sport utility vehicle. As we finally continued the short drive back toward our cabin, neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet feeling that arrives when uncertainty has finally given way to clarity. Watching the sun settle behind the tall pines along Pine Ridge Lake, I understood that the most important part of the afternoon had never been the moment Emily revealed her credentials. It had been everything that happened beforehand, because patience had allowed appearances to give way to facts, and facts have a remarkable way of standing on their own. The days following the roadside stop were surprisingly quiet, but it was the kind of silence that usually follows the moment when everyone realizes something important has changed. Pine Ridge Lake looked exactly as it always had. Early morning fog drifted across the water, fishing boats left their docks before sunrise, and neighbors walked their dogs beneath rows of towering pine trees. Yet conversations throughout the community had taken on a different tone. Instead of discussing landscaping rules or upcoming association meetings, people quietly exchanged stories about encounters they had never reported because they assumed nobody would believe them. My phone began ringing almost every evening. A retired firefighter described being questioned while visiting his daughter's home. A local electrician explained how volunteers had photographed his work truck before allowing him to continue toward a client's driveway. An elderly widow admitted she had stopped inviting friends to stay overnight because she worried they would be confronted at the neighborhood entrance. Each story sounded remarkably similar to the one I had witnessed beside the lake. Emily never encouraged anyone to exaggerate. She simply reminded every caller to write down exactly what happened, include dates if possible, and preserve any letters, photographs, or messages connected to the incidents. Watching her organize information at our kitchen table reminded me of assembling construction plans before beginning a bridge project. One reliable measurement rarely tells the entire story, but dozens of consistent details eventually reveal a complete structure. A week later, county investigators contacted several residents who had witnessed or experienced previous roadside stops. Their approach reflected the same professionalism Emily had shown from the beginning. They listened patiently, verified timelines, requested photographs of the magnetic vehicle decals and identification cards, and compared statements without rushing toward conclusions. Every conversation centered on documented facts rather than assumptions. Meanwhile, Kevin Dawson became noticeably quieter around the neighborhood. His regular community newsletters suddenly stopped appearing in mailboxes, and the volunteer patrol vehicles no longer drove their familiar evening routes through Pine Ridge Lake. The uniforms disappeared almost overnight, leaving only ordinary pickup trucks and family sport utility vehicles parked in familiar driveways. One Saturday morning I walked to the marina for coffee and noticed several longtime residents gathered near the boat launch. Instead of speaking in whispers, they openly discussed what had happened. For the first time since we moved to the community, neighbors who barely knew one another compared similar experiences without fear of being dismissed. It struck me that confidence often grows naturally when people realize they are not standing alone. Emily remained exactly the same person she had always been. She watered flowers outside our cabin, baked fresh bread on Sunday afternoons, and smiled at every neighbor we passed during evening walks. If someone had not witnessed the roadside stop, they would never have guessed she had quietly become the turning point in a much larger story. One evening we sat together on the end of our dock watching the last orange light fade behind the trees. Gentle waves tapped softly against the weathered wood while loons called from the far side of the lake. I asked whether she believed everything would eventually return to normal. She thought for a moment before answering with a quiet smile. Normal is not always the goal, she said. Sometimes the goal is making sure the next family never has to experience the same problem. Listening to the peaceful sounds surrounding us, I realized the real change had never been about one roadside stop. It was about an entire community finally choosing truth over appearances. Several weeks later, the investigation had quietly accomplished something that months of neighborhood arguments never could. Instead of relying on opinions, county officials completed a careful review of documents, witness statements, photographs, and recorded timelines gathered from dozens of residents throughout Pine Ridge Lake. Every piece of information was examined on its own before being compared with the others. The process moved slowly, but it also moved with the kind of consistency that earns public trust. Official notices soon appeared announcing changes to several homeowners association procedures, while independent legal and administrative reviews addressed the actions of the volunteer patrol program. No dramatic speeches filled the community clubhouse. No angry crowds gathered outside neighborhood meetings. The transformation happened through orderly decisions supported by documented facts. Kevin Dawson eventually stepped away from his leadership position, and the remaining board members agreed to hold new elections supervised under updated community procedures. Watching that transition unfold reminded me of replacing the damaged foundation beneath an old bridge. The work rarely attracts attention because most people only notice the finished result, but lasting stability always begins beneath the surface where careful planning matters most. Emily never celebrated what happened as though someone had won a competition. One evening while we walked beside the shoreline collecting smooth stones for the flower beds around our cabin, I asked whether she felt satisfied now that everything had finally changed. She smiled thoughtfully before answering. The goal was never to embarrass anyone, she said. The goal was to protect people who trusted the system. That simple sentence explained everything better than any official report ever could. As autumn settled over the lake, the community slowly rediscovered its ordinary rhythm. Families returned to evening walks without worrying about unnecessary roadside questions. Delivery trucks entered the neighborhood without being delayed by volunteer checkpoints. Visitors parked beside the marina, launched their boats, and spent peaceful afternoons on the water exactly as they always should have been able to do. Even the atmosphere at homeowners association meetings felt noticeably different. Agendas were distributed in advance, questions received respectful answers, and discussions centered on maintaining the neighborhood instead of controlling it. One Saturday morning I helped repair a section of the community dock alongside several neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before everything happened. We laughed about fishing stories, compared favorite barbecue recipes, and watched children race bicycles along the lakeside path. Looking around, it struck me that trust had quietly returned, not because people forgot the past, but because they had learned from it. Before leaving the dock, one elderly resident placed a hand on my shoulder and thanked both Emily and me for refusing to ignore what so many others had accepted. I told him the truth. Emily deserved far more credit than I ever would because she understood something I had only learned through watching her. Real authority is never measured by how convincingly someone wears a uniform or displays a badge. It is measured by integrity, restraint, and the willingness to let facts speak louder than appearances. As the evening sun reflected across Pine Ridge Lake once again, the familiar scent of cedar drifted through the cool air, and for the first time in many months, the quiet surrounding our cabin felt exactly the way peace is supposed to feel, earned honestly, protected lawfully, and shared by an entire community. Almost a year has passed since that quiet afternoon beside Pine Ridge Lake, Yet every time I drive along the same stretch of road I still slow down for a moment without even thinking about it. The gravel shoulder looks exactly as it always did. The tall pine trees still sway gently whenever the wind crosses the lake, the water still reflects the changing colors of every season, and families continue walking along the shoreline with fishing poles, picnic baskets, and laughing children. Nothing about the landscape remembers what happened there, but I always do. Our lives eventually settled back into the peaceful rhythm we had always hoped for. My construction company continued restoring bridges throughout the county, and Emily returned to the routine she preferred, helping people quietly without ever asking for recognition. Most neighbors never spoke about that afternoon anymore. They no longer needed to because the community itself had become the proof that lasting change is possible when people choose honesty over intimidation. The Homeowners Association still exists, but it now focuses on maintaining parks, organizing neighborhood events, and improving shared spaces instead of creating unnecessary confrontations. New families moving into Pine Ridge Lake often tell us how welcoming everyone seems. They have no idea that the sense of trust surrounding them today was rebuilt one careful decision at a time. Every now and then someone recognizes Emily from county meetings or public events and thanks her for what she did. She always smiles politely before changing the conversation to something else. That has never changed. She still believes the best outcome is the one where ordinary families can enjoy ordinary lives without ever needing to know who solved the problem. One cool autumn evening we carried 2 folding chairs onto the end of our dock and watched the sun disappear behind the hills while the water slowly turned from blue to deep shades of gold. The familiar scent of cedar drifted through the air exactly as it had on the day we first visited this lake years earlier. I asked Emily whether she had ever regretted remaining silent for so long before revealing who she really was. She looked across the calm water for a long moment before answering with the same thoughtful expression that first made me fall in love with her. People reveal their character when they believe nobody is testing it, she said quietly. Sometimes patience tells the truth more clearly than confrontation ever could. I realized then that the real lesson had never been about uniforms, badges, or appearances. It had been about character. Fake authority depends on attention, fear, and performance. Real authority depends on responsibility, restraint, and respect for the law. Looking back now, I understand why Emily never rushed to interrupt anyone that afternoon beside the lake. She knew that facts become strongest when they are allowed to stand on their own. Every observation, every question, every calm pause had quietly built a foundation that no argument could have created. As darkness settled over Pine Ridge Lake and the first stars appeared above the still water, I wrapped an arm around my wife and listened to the gentle waves touching the dock beneath our feet. The road where everything changed had become just another peaceful part of the neighborhood again, and somehow that felt like the greatest ending any family could hope for. Justice had not arrived with anger or noise. It arrived with patience, integrity, and the quiet confidence that truth never needs to pretend to be something it is not.